The headline is true, but it is still too clean. What actually happened in South Lebanon was messier, uglier, and more dangerous than a death count on a screen. So by the time the Security Council was pulled into this, the battlefield had already started consuming the men sent there to witness it. Before the world started debating who killed the peacekeepers, a tank round had already landed 15 meters from a UNIFIL vehicle and punctured it. That is where this story really begins. Not with diplomacy, not with condolences, but with the moment a peacekeeping patrol learned that being marked UN no longer meant the battlefield would stop at the edge of its hood. Then the number that broke through every layer of noise hit all at once. 3 Indonesian UN peacekeepers were killed in 2 separate incidents in southern Lebanon after a weekend already stained by the deaths of journalists, medics, and civilians. That is why people click this title with a jolt in their chest. When even the men sent to monitor the war start dying inside it, the war has stopped respecting its own supposed limits. And the diplomatic shock was real, not decorative. France requested an urgent UN Security Council meeting after the 3 deaths and made sure its condemnation was delivered directly to Israel. So the title is not overselling anything. 3 blue helmets were killed, and the world's top security body was forced to react because the institution meant to stand above the war had just been hit by the logic of the war itself. If you want the layer beneath the headline instead of the safe television version of it, subscribe now. And tell me in the comments what you think this really was. Battlefield chaos, or the moment South Lebanon became a place where even UN peacekeepers could be boxed in, fired near, and killed without the world stopping it first. Now strip away the safe wording. 3 peacekeepers killed, Security Council meets, sounds like tragedy, followed by procedure. The real sequence is much worse. A mission designed to separate violence from accountability was already under direct pressure before the deaths made denial impossible. The most devastating incident came near Bani Hayyan, where 2 UNIFIL peacekeepers were killed when an explosion of unknown origin destroyed their vehicle. That fact alone should wreck any comforting idea that the mission was somehow standing. Outside the main line of violence, a marked UN vehicle was not observing the war from a buffer. It was blown apart. Inside the same kill zone, everyone else was trying to survive. The initial finding narrowed the mechanism, a roadside explosion that helps, but only up to a point. It tells you how the 2 men died, not who laid the device, who controlled that stretch of road, or which actor most needs the public to lock onto its version of the answer before the investigation hardens. That distinction is everything in this kind of war. Mechanism is forensic. Responsibility is political, and there is always a dangerous gap between the two, because the side that fills that gap first usually shapes public memory long before the investigators finish their work. That is why the earlier warning shots matter so much. On the 28th of March, the Israel Defense Forces fired warning shots at a UNIFIL patrol near a newly established checkpoint north of Nakora headquarters. That means the pressure on peacekeepers did not begin with the fatal blast. It was already visible in the operating environment before the bodies were even counted. Put that sequence together and it stops looking like a freak chain of bad luck, warning shots at a patrol, a tank round 15 meters from a UN vehicle, then 3 Indonesian peacekeepers dead in 2 incidents. When events stack that tightly, the battlefield is telling you something the official statements are not. One message at the Security Council was to pause, reserve judgment, and let the UN fully investigate the circumstances of the deaths. That sounds measured, and in one sense it is, but it also reveals how fast the blame war began. Because nobody asks the world to slow down unless multiple narratives are already racing to seize the event. This is how information war works in real time. One side tries to sound calm and procedural, another tries to sound outraged and morally certain. The public thinks it is watching a debate over facts, when very often it is watching a competition over which emotional frame gets accepted before the facts are fully assembled. Indonesia did not respond like a country accepting routine mission danger. Foreign Minister Sugiono called the attacks heinous, spoke with Antonio Guterres and demanded an emergency Security Council meeting. That matters because Jakarta was not merely mourning three of its soldiers. It was signaling that what happened had crossed a threshold big enough to force the UN system into confrontation. And Indonesia had every reason to treat it that way. These were not anonymous casualties buried in a mission log. They were Indonesian troops serving under a UN mandate sent into South Lebanon on the assumption that blue helmets might still carry at least some minimum protection from the battlefield's worst logic. Inside the chamber, the line that captured the real institutional panic was simple. Attacks on peacekeepers are attacks on the council itself. That is the sentence that explains the title better than any headline ever could. The meeting was not just about grief. It was about the world body realizing that the force operating under its authority had been pulled into the casualty stream of the war. And once that happens, the meaning of force to meet changes. It no longer means the council stepped in because it was strong. It means the council had to show up because one of its own instruments had already been publicly broken. The meeting was not the first display of control. It was the first display of alarm. At the same moment, senior UN briefers warned that Israeli politicians were openly speaking about an extended security or buffer zone, together with the destruction of villages along the Blue Line and bridges across the Litani River. That is not side context. That is the map underneath the deaths. It tells you the war was not just striking targets, it was beginning to reshape territory. And once territory becomes the deeper objective, witness forces become a problem. Peacekeepers record who moved where. They document fire patterns, incursions, obstructions, and violations. They preserve the line between what happened on the ground and what each side later claims happened on camera. In a war that is physically redrawing space, that kind of witness can become inconvenient long before it becomes dead. Israeli forces were pushing into areas north of the frontier while officials announced plans for a buffer zone up to the Litani River, around 30 kilometers from Israel. That changes how every fatal incident around UNIFIL should be read. These deaths did not happen in a frozen standoff or a stable ceasefire environment. They happened during an active effort to change the geometry of southern Lebanon. And once the geometry changes, nothing in the south stays neutral for long. Roads become military questions. Patrol routes become political questions. Villages become future buffer territory. A UN convoy near Bani Hayyan stops being just a convoy and starts becoming one more object trapped inside a map that armed actors are trying to redraw under fire. The 3 peacekeeper deaths came as violence surged amid Israel's expanding invasion of southern Lebanon. That timeline matters because it destroys the fiction that these men died in some isolated pocket of danger. They died while the whole operational environment was intensifying, widening, and taking on a more openly offensive shape. This is the point where every official narrative starts serving a strategic purpose. Israel benefits from saying Hezbollah puts peacekeepers directly in harm's way by operating near their positions. Indonesia benefits from saying ongoing Israeli military operations created the deteriorating security environment that made these deaths possible. The UN benefits from holding the line on investigation while quietly describing a pattern that already looks structurally catastrophic. UN officials said they had seen a great deal of Israeli incursions into South Lebanon, including near their headquarters in Nakura. That single detail changes the emotional weight of the whole story. If incursions are happening near headquarters, then the mission is no longer standing beside the conflict. It is being physically absorbed by the conflict. That is the hidden violence beneath the title. Not only that 3 peacekeepers were killed, but that the space they were supposed to operate in as protected international personnel was already being eaten away. Headquarters pressure, patrol pressure, checkpoint pressure, road pressure, and then the fatalities. And that is what collapse looks like before anyone officially calls it collapse. The timing made all of this more dangerous still. These killings turned the current war into one of the deadliest chapters for a peacekeeping mission whose decades-long mandate expires this year. So the death struck UNIFIL at a moment when the future was already narrowing, its authority was already contested, and its enemies had every reason to treat it as weaker tomorrow than it was yesterday. that matters because missions near the end of their life are easier to pressure and easier to write off. They're easier to depict as failed, obsolete, or irrelevant. And in that environment, every fatal incident does double damage. It takes a life on the ground, and it weakens the political argument that the mission still has force, purpose, and room to operate. That is why the legal language turned so severe. Attacks on peacekeepers were described as grave violations of international humanitarian law and Resolution 1701, and as acts that may amount to war crimes. That is not boilerplate outrage. That is the international system warning that what happened here may belong in the category of criminal accountability, not just tragic battlefield spillover. But even that sentence has two edges. It raises the moral and legal stakes while still leaving room for tactical uncertainty over who did what in each specific incident. That is exactly why this story is so combustible. The public narrative wants a clean villain now. The evidence is still assembling, and the battlefield beneath both is already screaming that the deeper structure has broken either way. Here is the dual truth at the center of all of this. If the claim is true that Hezbollah devices or fire killed the peacekeepers, then an armed actor is operating lethal force close enough to UN personnel that the mission has become functionally exposed in its own zone. If that claim is false and Israeli military activity directly caused one or both fatal incidents, then a campaign framed as security is already consuming the international witnesses standing inside the area being reshaped. Either way, the conclusion barely moves. South Lebanon is becoming a place where the witness layer is dying, and once the witness layer dies, everything else gets easier for the men with the guns. Villages can be emptied and argued over later. Buffer zones can harden into facts. Civilians can vanish into numbers. Responsibility can be delayed, diluted, and displaced while the ground itself is being changed. And that is why this title pulls people in so hard. They are not just asking whether 3 UN peacekeepers were killed. They are asking whether those 3 deaths reveal something bigger and more frightening than a bad day in a bad war. The answer is yes. They reveal that the institution meant to stand between escalation and total darkness is now being dragged inside the casualty pattern of the war. It was sent to monitor. One of the dead, Private First Class Faris al-Ramadan, was remembered as a young father whose last communication with his family was a simple red heart emoji. That detail cuts through every sterile phrase wrapped around this story. Behind every line about a deteriorating security environment or an explosion of unknown origin was a man who trusted that the uniform he wore still meant the world would protect the mission he was sent to serve. So no, these 3 Indonesian peacekeepers were not just swallowed by anonymous battlefield chaos. They died inside a sequence that already included warning shots, near-miss tank fire, expanding territorial ambition, repeated incursions, and a Security Council reacting only after the dead made denial impossible. If the battlefield can kill the witnesses, the next phase of the war will not be easier to understand. It will be easier to hide. Say here, because this channel follows the point where official stories crack and the real map starts to show.